Togo's institutional coup, Faure Gnassingbé's new lifetime power, grab sparks Africa-wide alarm on democratic backsliding. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we uncover the hidden truths and critical shifts shaping our continent. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. In today's video, Togo's leader, Faure Gnassingbé, just took on a new role that could allow him to rule indefinitely. Is this a constitutional coup in disguise? What does this mean for the future of democracy in Africa? Stay with us as we break it all down with expert analysis, Africa-wide comparisons, and bold reflections you won't hear anywhere else. This is not just a Togo story, it's a warning for all of Africa. Let's dive in. A new title, an old strategy. In a move that has sent ripples across Africa's fragile democratic landscape, Togolese President Faure Gnassingbé has been sworn in as the President of the Council of Ministers, a newly created executive role that effectively places him above the state machinery with no term limits. This development follows controversial constitutional reforms that scrap direct presidential elections and introduce a parliamentary system, transferring significant powers to a figure appointed by the legislature, a body currently dominated by Gnassingbe's ruling party, Union for the Republic, UNIR. The National Assembly, in which UNIR controls 108 out of 113 seats, approved this transformation last year. Critics, including opposition figures and civil society groups, describe the changes as an institutional coup d'etat, engineered to cement a family dynasty that has governed Togo for 58 years. Historical context. A dynasty reinvented Faure Gnassingbé's rise to power in 2005 came immediately after the death of his father, Gnassingbé Eyadema, who ruled the West African nation with an iron grip from 1967 to 2005. The younger Gnassingbé has since won 4 presidential elections, each tainted by allegations of fraud, intimidation, and violent repression of dissent. What makes the recent constitutional reform particularly significant is its timing and structure. Coming on the back of a long-standing resistance movement calling for term limits and democratic accountability, the reform instead eliminates presidential elections altogether, concentrating power in the hands of a council president chosen by parliament, a body now almost entirely loyal to Gnassingbé. Critical analysis. Democratic camouflage or authoritarian reinvention. Though masked as a move toward parliamentary democracy, the new system offers no credible checks and balances. By scrapping presidential elections, the reform removes the last shred of direct popular participation in executive selection. It centralizes authority in a non-elected council president, who is chosen by MPs already under the thumb of the ruling party. This structure mirrors a broader trend of constitutional authoritarianism sweeping parts of Africa, where leaders use legal reforms to entrench indefinite rule. The tactic is deceptively elegant. Instead of staging military coups or overtly cracking down on opposition, power is consolidated through judicial instruments, parliamentary rubber stamps, and carefully staged electoral manipulation. Political analyst Kofi Mawunya, based in Accra, told BAV, "What we are witnessing is not a transition to parliamentary democracy, but a cloaked power entrenchment. Togo is creating a system where the illusion of democracy replaces its essence." Africa-wide comparison. Togo's move in a continental context. Togo is not alone in this maneuver. Across the continent, several leaders have exploited constitutional loopholes or initiated referenda to extend their grip on power. Rwanda. President Paul Kagame amended the constitution in 2015, allowing him to potentially remain in office until 2034. Uganda. President Yoweri Museveni, in power since 1986, oversaw the removal of age and term limits, effectively granting himself life tenure. Cameroon. President Paul Biya, now 91, has ruled since 1982 with repeated constitutional tweaks. Republic of Congo, Brazzaville. President Denis Sassou Nguesso also extended his reign through similar reforms. Chad, Burundi, and Guinea, before Condé's overthrow, saw similar trends, often accompanied by violent crackdowns on opposition. This wave of constitutional coups threatens not only national democratic institutions, but also regional stability, undermining ECOWAS's mandate and AU's democracy charters. Forward-looking analysis: what lies ahead for Togo and the region? The immediate future of Togo under Faure Gnassingbe's new title appears grim for democratic advocates. The upcoming municipal elections in July 2025, the first under the new constitution, will test the country's political climate. However, with opposition voices suppressed, civil society fragmented, and the media under increasing pressure, true political pluralism seems unlikely. Three forward-looking scenarios could define Togo's future. 1. Internal legitimacy crisis. Continued governance without genuine electoral legitimacy may result in mass protests, as seen during prior reform attempts in 2017-2018. 2. International isolation or sanctions. If ECOWAS and the African Union, AU, take a harder stance, Togo could face diplomatic pressure, aid suspensions, or targeted sanctions, although these bodies have shown inconsistency in dealing with entrenched regimes. 3. Copycat moves. Togo's case could embolden leaders in fragile democracies, such as the Central African Republic or Equatorial Guinea, to pursue similar reforms, exacerbating democratic regression on the continent. Despite the bleak outlook, regional civil society coalitions, diaspora mobilizations, and digital activism may still hold potential to reignite democratic movements, particularly if coordinated across borders. Regional silence or strategic engagement, the role of ECOWAS and the African Union. As Togo charts a course toward authoritarian permanence under a new constitutional framework, the question now turns to how regional and continental bodies will respond, if at all. ECOWAS, a test of principles and political will. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has long styled itself as a bulwark against unconstitutional changes of government in West Africa. Its Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, 2001, explicitly prohibits political arrangements that undermine democratic rule, including constitutional manipulations to prolong tenure of office. Yet ECOWAS has been selectively vocal, quick to condemn military coups in Mali, Guinea, and Niger, but noticeably quiet when democratic erosion occurs via legal frameworks. In Togo's case, ECOWAS has so far refrained from issuing a formal condemnation of the constitutional reform. This silence speaks volumes. It suggests that the organization is either unwilling or unable to confront cases where authoritarianism is draped in legality. Some analysts argue that ECOWAS's hands are tied due to the growing number of member states led by entrenched rulers with similar governance structures. For instance, both Ivory Coast's Alassane Ouattara and Senegal's now departed Macky Sall faced criticism for extending their rule through controversial interpretations of term limits. The political calculus within ECOWAS often leans toward non-confrontation among incumbents, fearing that setting a precedent may boomerang within their own countries. Moreover, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso's recent withdrawal from ECOWAS, citing Western-aligned biases and the bloc's inconsistency, has weakened ECOWAS's moral authority and bargaining power, making it less effective in dealing with internal crises of legitimacy. African Union, AU, normative frameworks without enforcement teeth. The African Union Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, 2007, provides a continent-wide normative framework that rejects any unconstitutional change of government including amendments or revisions of the Constitution which infringe the principles of democratic change of power. However, in practice, the AU has struggled to enforce these principles consistently. In response to military coups, the AU often acts swiftly, suspending countries, imposing sanctions, and demanding transitions. But in cases like Togo, where a pseudo-legal process has been used, the AU has remained largely silent or issued tepid statements urging dialogue. This discrepancy reveals a core challenge within the AU, a tension between sovereignty and supranational accountability. The AU's consensus-driven decision-making model, dominated by heads of state, often leads to institutional paralysis when member governments are the very actors undermining democracy. AU reform advocates have long called for the establishment of a democracy monitoring and enforcement unit empowered to investigate, report, and recommend action on democratic violations. However, progress has stalled, in part due to resistance from long-serving leaders who view such mechanisms as threats to their political survival. Implications for regional stability and integration. Togo's trajectory carries broader implications beyond its borders. It challenges the viability of West African regional integration efforts, which rest on shared governance principles, economic cooperation, and political stability. Key risks include precedent setting. Togo's model of constitutional engineering may become a template for authoritarian survival in other countries. Erosion of trust in regional bodies. Inaction from ECOWAS and the AU may undermine citizen faith in regional institutions as protectors of democratic norms. Migration and security spillovers, political repression and economic stagnation resulting from governance failures could lead to increased migration, brain drain, and social unrest, spilling over into neighboring Ghana, Benin, and Burkina Faso. Citizen resistance and the role of the Togolese diaspora. Despite state control over institutions, resistance within Togo persists, particularly among youth movements, civil society organizations, and the diaspora community. Groups like Togo Debout, Let's Save Togo Collective, and civil associations abroad continue to mobilize through digital platforms, raising international awareness and lobbying for sanctions or diplomatic pressure. The Togolese diaspora, notably in France, Germany, and the United States, has intensified campaigns calling on the EU and UN to reject the legitimacy of the new constitutional order. However, without concrete international response, these voices risk being marginalized or repressed, as has occurred in previous years through targeted surveillance, arrests, and alleged cyber harassment. Digital activism, though powerful, faces systemic suppression through internet shutdowns, press censorship, and anti-cybercrime laws weaponized against dissent. In 2023 alone, Reporters Without Borders ranked Togo 120th out of 180 in the World Press Freedom Index, highlighting the shrinking civic space. International reactions, strategic silence, or complicit engagement. As Togo's regime, under Faure Gnassingbé, transitions into a new era of indefinite rule through constitutional redesign, the international community's response becomes a vital dimension in either legitimizing or challenging this power entrenchment. The muted response from key geopolitical players so far reveals a disturbing global trend: the prioritization of strategic interests over democratic principles. France, ties that bind beyond democracy. Togo, a former French colony, maintains deep economic and political ties with France, which has historically exerted considerable influence over its governance. Paris has often been accused of propping up the Gnassingbé dynasty, especially during the 2005 transition when Faure Gnassingbé was quickly installed following his father's death, with military and diplomatic backing. Under President Emmanuel Macron's reset of France-Africa relations, There were promises of a more principled foreign policy that would distance Paris from its post-colonial legacy of supporting strongmen. However, in the case of Togo, France has remained largely silent, offering no clear condemnation of the new constitutional changes. Analysts argue that France's strategic calculus in the Gulf of Guinea, especially in light of deteriorating relations with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, has prompted it to avoid antagonizing relatively stable allies like Togo. The threat of expanding Russian and Chinese influence in Francophone Africa further incentivizes France to tolerate democratic backsliding if it ensures geopolitical alignment. Moreover, French corporate interests, particularly in sectors like telecommunications, infrastructure, and banking, continue to enjoy preferential treatment under Gnassingbé's government, reinforcing a network of elite patronage that benefits from the status quo. United States, democracy promotion on pause. The United States, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, has consistently framed its foreign policy toward Africa around themes of democracy, good governance, and human rights. However, when it comes to Togo, the U.S. response to the recent constitutional changes has been notably restrained. While the U.S. State Department has previously issued general statements of concern over electoral irregularities and repression in Togo, there has been no specific condemnation of the April 2024 constitutional amendments that abolished presidential elections. Instead, U.S. interests in West Africa, particularly regarding counterterrorism cooperation, maritime security, and stability in the Sahel region, appear to outweigh concerns over governance in small but strategically located nations like Togo. Furthermore, Togo's participation in military partnerships, such as the African Contingency Operations Training and Assistance (ACOTA) program, and maritime security collaborations in the Gulf of Guinea, positions it as a useful partner regardless of its internal democratic trajectory. European Union, aid without accountability. The European Union, EU, remains one of Togo's largest development partners, providing aid for infrastructure, health, education, and governance reform. Paradoxically, much of this aid is earmarked for democracy promotion and institutional strengthening. Despite this, the EU has not publicly challenged or sanctioned the institutional reforms introduced by Faure Gnassingbé's government. Some EU lawmakers have raised concerns in the European Parliament, but no formal measures have been introduced to condition aid on democratic benchmarks or human rights performance. Critics argue this exposes the EU's credibility gap as it continues to fund governance programs in countries where the rule of law is being undermined by those very same institutions. A recent report by the European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECDPM, noted, without accountability mechanisms tied to aid, the EU risks subsidizing the very regimes that erode democratic norms while claiming to uphold them. China and Russia, opportunity in authoritarian stability. In contrast to the West's wavering, China and Russia have seized on Togo's constitutional transition as an opportunity. China, already heavily involved in infrastructure projects in Lomé, including roads, stadiums, and port expansions, has ramped up its diplomatic overtures, emphasizing non-interference and mutual respect for sovereignty. Russia, through its embassies and media networks, has presented Togo's move as an internal matter, portraying Western critics as neo-colonial meddlers. With increased military and security cooperation across Africa, Moscow is likely to offer security services and political support to regimes like Togo's in exchange for strategic access and diplomatic alignment, especially in UN forums. This growing multipolar influence complicates any coordinated international pressure campaign and undermines democratic norms by offering alternative partners unconcerned with governance standards. The economic fallout of democratic regression, Togo's growth mirage, and social vulnerabilities. While Faure Gnassingbé's grip on power appears unshakable in political terms, the economic undercurrents in Togo tell a more fragile story. The long-term sustainability of authoritarian consolidation is increasingly being questioned as economic indicators expose rising inequality, youth disillusionment, and structural vulnerabilities in the Togolese economy. Growth without transformation, the mirage of stability. Over the past decade, Togo's government has proudly reported moderate GDP growth, averaging between 4.5% and 5.5% annually. Backed by International Monetary Fund, IMF structural programs, and World Bank loans, Lomé has implemented reforms in public finance management, infrastructure, and business climate improvements, earning praise from donors and investors alike. However, beneath this veneer of macroeconomic stability lies a deeply extractive political economy. According to the African Development Bank, or AFDB, and UNDP, Togo continues to suffer from high unemployment and underemployment, particularly among youth, with more than 60% of the labor force in informal or subsistence activities. Low industrial diversification, with an economy still reliant on phosphate mining, cotton exports, and port revenues from Lomé. Persistent rural poverty, especially in the northern and central regions where development gaps have widened under Gnassingbé's rule. The ruling party's centralization of economic rents, including through politically connected business elites and opaque procurement systems, means that economic gains are unevenly distributed, reinforcing clientelism and regional disparities. The cost of authoritarianism, investor confidence, and the rule of law. In the short term, some international investors may view political stability, even if undemocratic, as conducive to business. However, in the long term, the erosion of judicial independence, rule of law, and institutional accountability is likely to deter sustainable foreign direct investment, FDI. Togo's World Bank Ease of Doing Business ranking, which had improved significantly by 2020, has since stagnated. Concerns about contract enforcement, land rights, and regulatory unpredictability are growing, especially among small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, and local entrepreneurs. A 2024 report by Transparency International found that corruption and political patronage remain the primary obstacles to private sector-led growth in Togo. Without institutional reforms, donor-driven projects risk being co-opted by elite networks. The IMF's latest Article 4 consultation with Togo, April 2024, also warned that while growth remains resilient, governance weaknesses and limited fiscal transparency could undermine development outcomes and increase debt distress risks. Migration and brain drain, the youth exodus. Togo's authoritarian model has also led to widening socio-political alienation among the youth, a demographic that constitutes nearly 70% of the population. With limited job prospects, shrinking civic space, and growing distrust in state institutions, many young Togolese view migration as the only viable future. According to the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and ECOWAS migration profiles, Togo is experiencing a surge in irregular migration through the Sahel corridor toward North Africa and Europe. A growing pool of skilled professionals, including doctors, engineers, and teachers, leaving for the diaspora due to lack of opportunity and political repression. Rising domestic tensions in urban centers like Lomé and Sokode, where youth unemployment has fueled intermittent protests, often met with violent crackdowns. The loss of human capital, coupled with low levels of diaspora remittances compared to neighboring countries like Ghana or Nigeria, creates a vicious cycle of stagnation and disenfranchisement. Public debt and fiscal vulnerability. Togo's debt to GDP ratio stands at approximately 65% as of early 2025, according to the IMF, below regional thresholds but rising steadily. Much of the debt has been accrued through infrastructure borrowing, particularly from China's Exim Bank and multilateral lenders. While roads, bridges, and ports have expanded, debt servicing costs are increasing, placing pressure on social spending and service delivery. Recent subsidy cuts to fuel and electricity, as recommended by IMF stabilization programs, have led to price shocks, disproportionately affecting the poor. At the same time, military and security spending has expanded, reflecting the regime's prioritization of regime protection over welfare. Civil servants, teachers, and health workers have reported delays in salary payments, triggering strikes and union demands, while hospitals remain underfunded and poorly equipped, a glaring contradiction in a country that proclaims national development as its mantra. Brewing discontent. The societal time bomb beneath Togo's authoritarian calm. While Faure Gnassingbé's regime maintains a firm grip on state institutions, security forces, and legislative control, a quieter, more unpredictable resistance is festering beneath the surface, rooted in deep social inequality, regional marginalization, and generational frustration. Togo's long-term political and economic exclusion threatens not only the cohesion of the state, but also the regime's illusion of indefinite invulnerability. Ethno-regional fault lines, north-south divide, and elite patronage. Togo has long grappled with a regional imbalance in power and resource allocation, most visibly between the predominantly Kabye-speaking north, where the Gnassingbé family originates, and the more populous Yiwi-speaking south, centered around Lomé and surrounding regions. Since the era of Gnassingbé Eyadema, the regime has strategically favored northern elites in the military, civil service, and political appointments, creating a perception of ethno-regional domination. This has bred distrust and resentment in southern and central regions, where development indicators remain lower and where opposition movements have historically drawn their strongest support. This divide has only deepened under Faure Gnassingbé, whose military promotions, cabinet compositions, and security deployments continue to disproportionately benefit his northern Kabye loyalists. In contrast, critical voices from the south, especially from Lomé's university campuses and trade unions, have faced harassment, surveillance, and arrests. Such structural exclusion fuels identity-based grievance politics, a dangerous trend that has destabilized several African states, from Ivory Coast's post-electoral crisis in 2010 to Ethiopia's ethnic federal implosion and Cameroon's Anglophone conflict. Without inclusive reforms, Togo risks spiraling into latent or open conflict, especially if opposition to the regime begins to align with ethno-regional narratives. A lost generation, disillusionment, distrust, and defiance. For Togolese youth, many of whom have known no other leader but Faure Gnassingbé, politics feels less like a participatory platform and more like a rigged system. Public trust in institutions, particularly the Electoral Commission, judiciary, and legislature, is alarmingly low, according to surveys by Afrobarometer and local civil society watchdogs like RAD and CACIT. This democratic alienation is compounded by youth unemployment rates that hover above 35%, especially in urban centers, widespread perceptions of nepotism and elite capture of state opportunities, censorship of social media, and arbitrary detention of student and labor union leaders, limited civic education, with authoritarian pedagogy still present in public schools. The youth's disengagement from formal political processes, however, does not mean they are apolitical. Instead, many are turning to informal activism, digital resistance, music, spoken word, and satire as forms of expression and protest. In 2023, the viral song 58 Ans Ça Suffit by underground artists sparked a series of symbolic protests, showing the potential for creative dissent even under repression. As seen in Sudan's 2019 uprising, Burkina Faso's 2014 revolution, and Senegal's recent anti-third term movements, youth-led mobilizations, even when suppressed, can eventually ignite broader societal shifts when least expected. Opposition in disarray, fragmentation, and co-optation. Despite widespread discontent, Togo's formal political opposition remains fractured and weakened. Parties such as the National Alliance for Change, ANC, and the Pan-African National Party, PNP, have faced decades of harassment, infiltration, and legal restrictions, making it difficult to mount a unified challenge. In recent years, several high-profile opposition leaders have either gone into exile, e.g., Tikpai Achadam of the PNP, been arrested or placed under surveillance, or entered into power-sharing arrangements that eroded their legitimacy among core supporters. This opposition vacuum creates space for new, non-traditional actors to emerge, from independent youth movements and human rights networks to religious and cultural leaders with grassroots influence. However, without a cohesive political vision or organizational infrastructure, these movements risk being outmaneuvered or absorbed by the regime. Still, history has shown that authoritarian durability is not invincibility. The more a regime suppresses formal opposition, the more likely it is that non-institutional spontaneous revolts, unpredictable and often leaderless, become the eventual spark for change. Forecasting Togo's future, scenarios of political evolution and democratic recovery. As Togo stands at a pivotal crossroads, the consolidation of power by Faure Gnassingbé through constitutional engineering has not only altered the country's governance architecture, but also cast a long shadow over its future political stability. To understand what lies ahead, it is necessary to explore plausible future scenarios, weighing the potential for reform, revolt, or further repression, each shaped by internal dynamics, regional pressures, and global geopolitical shifts. Scenario 1. Status quo. Entrenchment. The rise of neo-authoritarian parliamentarism. In this scenario, Faure Gnassingbé remains firmly in control through the President of the Council of Ministers post, backed by a loyal legislature, compliant judiciary, and well-funded security apparatus. The July 2025 municipal elections are managed tightly, with little space for opposition gains, reinforcing the regime's claim to procedural legitimacy. Key features. The new parliamentary system is used to rotate loyalists in ceremonial roles, maintaining the facade of institutional dynamism while real power remains centralized. Civil society remains under surveillance, opposition media is stifled, and the diaspora's influence is curtailed through cyber censorship and diplomatic pressure. International partners continue engagement, prioritizing stability and counterterrorism cooperation over democratic accountability. Risks. Though the regime may enjoy temporary calm, this path risks long-term societal decay, deepening inequality, youth alienation, and erosion of institutional capacity. History across Africa shows that unchecked regimes eventually face legitimacy crises, often triggered by economic shocks or elite defections. Scenario 2. Popular uprising, the ticking time bomb of youth discontent. This scenario envisions a spontaneous, decentralized mass uprising, potentially sparked by economic hardship, symbolic repression, or catalytic events such as a student death in police custody or mass layoffs. Key features. Youth, informal workers, students, and unemployed graduates take to the streets in protest. Protests begin in Lomé, Sokode, and Kara, spreading rapidly due to social media mobilization. The regime responds with brutal crackdowns, but loses control as security defections or mutinies occur, forcing negotiations or collapse. Historical parallels: Burkina Faso 2014, Blaise Compaoré's ousting after 27 years. Sudan 2019, Omar al-Bashir removed after months of youth-led street protests. Tunisia 2011, a fruit vendor's self-immolation sparked the Arab Spring. Risks: the absence of organized political structures may lead to a power vacuum, potential military intervention, or chaotic transitions without a clear reform pathway. Scenario 3: negotiated transition, elite realignment, and incremental reform. This more optimistic scenario assumes pressure builds gradually, both from internal reformists within the regime and external actors, ECOWAS, AU, EU, diaspora, compelling Gnassingbé to negotiate a managed transition. Key features: a national dialogue or sovereign conference is convened with civil society, traditional leaders, and opposition groups. A revised constitution is drafted to restore direct elections, term limits, and judicial independence. Faure Gnassingbé is granted immunity and honorary status, allowing him to exit gracefully while saving face. Opportunities: this model mirrors the Benin transition, 1990, and South Africa's negotiated end to apartheid, where strong civil coalitions, international diplomacy, and elite bargains paved the way for systemic change. Risks: this route requires political will from within the regime, which may not exist unless the cost of repression outweighs the benefit of continued power. Scenario 4: regional domino effect, the reversal of authoritarian norms. In this forward looking Pan African scenario, regional and continental bodies such as ECOWAS and the African Union undergo reforms, developing enforcement mechanisms against constitutional coups and coordinating pressure on backsliding regimes. Key developments: ECOWAS establishes a Democratic Integrity Commission with investigatory powers and sanctions authority. The AU enforces the Charter on Democracy and Elections, conditioning membership benefits and aid on governance benchmarks. Regional solidarity builds among youth and civil society groups across borders, creating a transnational democratic resistance network. In this context, Togo could become a test case or beneficiary of renewed continental resolve to defend democracy rather than a poster child for its decay. Policy pathways for democratic renewal: actors, strategies, and leverage points. As Togo teeters between consolidated authoritarianism and latent societal resistance, the urgency to mobilize for democratic renewal has never been greater. The country's current trajectory is not inevitable. It is a product of choices made by institutions, political elites, regional bodies, and the international community. But these choices can be challenged, reshaped, and redirected. Below are strategic recommendations for key stakeholders with the power and responsibility to help steer Togo toward a more inclusive and accountable future. 1. Togolese civil society, rekindling a movement from below. Civil society in Togo has shown resilience in the face of surveillance, repression, and co-optation. Groups such as Togo Debout, Citoyens et Citoyennes Debout, RAID, and CACIT have long championed transparency, civic education, and electoral reform. Yet fragmentation and fear have weakened coordination. Strategic actions unite fragmented civic actors into a broad-based coalition, including youth groups, professional unions, artists, and religious leaders. Shift focus from electoral cycles to year-round civic engagement, using community dialogues, civic tech tools, and storytelling campaigns to educate and mobilize. Train a new generation of grassroots organizers capable of leading nonviolent resistance and local issue-based advocacy, especially in underserved rural areas. create early warning networks to monitor human rights abuses and electoral irregularities, feeding data to regional and international watchdogs. Key leverage. By occupying moral authority and engaging at the community level, civil society can reshape national narratives, rebuild political consciousness, and prepare the groundwork for sustained democratic pressure. 2. The Togolese diaspora, global voice, local impact. The Togolese diaspora, especially in France, Germany, Canada, and the US, holds untapped potential as a financial, intellectual, and advocacy force. Strategic actions. Organize under a unified transnational network to conduct media campaigns, policy lobbying, and remittance-based development projects tied to democratic benchmarks. Pressure international institutions, e.g., EU Parliament, US, Congress, UN Human Rights Council, to place Togo's crisis on their agendas and condition development aid on governance reforms. Support exile activists and independent journalists, offering them platforms to speak globally and tools to evade digital repression. Launch a diaspora democratic fund to finance community empowerment projects, legal aid for detained activists, and election monitoring initiatives back home. Key leverage. The diaspora can bypass state propaganda, shape international perceptions, and fund autonomous pro-democracy infrastructure inside Togo. 3. ECOWAS. From rhetoric to responsibility. ECOWAS has a legal and moral obligation to defend democratic norms, as enshrined in its protocol on democracy and good governance. Its silence on Togo is a missed opportunity to reaffirm its credibility. Strategic actions invoke the protocol's Article 1 C, which prohibits constitutional manipulation for term extension, and demand an emergency session on Togo. Deploy a high-level mediation mission, including former presidents and regional statesmen, to open dialogue between the regime and opposition civil society. Establish a democracy compliance review body that regularly assesses member states' constitutional practices and electoral integrity. Offer technical and financial support for parliamentary reform, electoral commission independence, and judicial review processes. Key leverage. ECOWAS can use aid conditionality, suspension threats, and regional diplomacy to press for reforms without military confrontation. 4. The African Union, enforcer of its own charter. The African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance is one of the continent's most progressive legal instruments, yet among the least enforced. Strategic actions trigger Article 23 of the Charter, which applies sanctions for unconstitutional changes of government, including amendments infringing democratic change. Mandate the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to investigate political repression in Togo and publish findings. Empower the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, to include mandatory governance assessments for all member states every 5 years. Convene a continental summit on constitutionalism and democratic backsliding, using Togo as a case study to generate continent-wide solutions. Key leverage. The AU can shape a Pan-African precedent, reinforcing that legality without legitimacy will not be tolerated in modern Africa. 5. International partners, aligning aid with accountability. Togo receives significant foreign assistance, particularly from the EU, World Bank, IMF, France, and Germany. This aid must become more conditional, transparent, and rights-based. Strategic actions tie budgetary support and debt restructuring to concrete democratic indicators, including press freedom, judicial independence, and anti-corruption enforcement. Support independent media, fact-checking organizations, and digital security training for activists. Press for timely, credible municipal and parliamentary elections, monitored by neutral observers and protected by civil society engagement. Fund inclusive economic development that bypasses regime-controlled entities and directly benefits communities, particularly in neglected regions. Key leverage. Donors wield substantial financial influence. By aligning money with democratic metrics, They can avoid enabling authoritarian stability and instead incentivize reform. Togo as a mirror. Lessons for Africa's democratic crossroads. Togo's slow-motion constitutional coup is not merely a national tragedy, it is a continental reflection, a microcosm of Africa's deeper democratic dilemma. As Faure Gnassingbé consolidates power under the guise of legal transformation, he is not just rewriting Togo's constitution, but redefining the boundaries of democratic legitimacy in Africa. This moment must therefore serve as both a warning and a wake-up call. Togo's cautionary lessons for Africa. 1. Authoritarianism no longer wears a uniform, it wears a constitution. Gone are the days when coups required guns and tanks. Today's most enduring power grabs are dressed in legal language, passed through loyal parliaments, and announced in polished press conferences. Togo teaches us that the most dangerous coups are those carried out in suits, not fatigues. 2. Democracy without institutions. Is a shell holding elections is not democracy. The weakness of Togo's judiciary, rubber-stamp legislature, and co-opted electoral commission proves that institutions matter more than procedures. Any African country relying solely on elections while neglecting the independence of institutions and rule of law risks sliding into constitutional authoritarianism. 3. Silence enables tyranny. The absence of timely, forceful responses from ECOWAS, the AU, and major donor states has emboldened Gnassingbé's actions. Togo is not the first, and will not be the last, to exploit global distraction and regional complicity. This silence normalizes illegality, encouraging other regimes to pursue similar power grabs. 4. Youth are watching and waiting. Across the continent, young people are the largest demographic, and they are not fooled by legal manipulations and ceremonial elections. Togo's youth may seem silent today, but if history is any guide, they will not remain passive forever. From Ouagadougou to Khartoum, no regime has successfully silenced a generation that believes it has no future. 5. Democracy must be defended daily. Togo's experience underscores a truth Africa must confront. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be nurtured, protected, and fought for. This responsibility does not fall on governments alone. It belongs to citizens, journalists, teachers, unions, religious leaders, artists, and diaspora communities. The road ahead: silence or legacy. Africa stands today at a critical juncture. The choice between authoritarian convenience and democratic resilience will define not only the fate of nations like Togo, but the moral fabric of the entire continent. Leaders who manipulate constitutions to rule indefinitely are not just betraying their people, they are erasing the very promise of Africa's post-independence dream. A continent governed by the will of its people, not the ambitions of its elites. The question is not just for Faure Gnassingbé, it is for every African leader, legislator, and citizen. Will you be remembered as builders of nations or as architects of decline? Will you write history with courage or erase it with fear? Stories of hope, Africa's democratic bright spots. While Togo's regression paints a grim picture of constitutional manipulation and dynastic rule, it is important to highlight that authoritarianism is not Africa's destiny. Across the continent, several countries, despite immense challenges, have demonstrated that democratic renewal is possible, and that citizen action, institutional courage, and political accountability can reverse autocratic tides. Zambia, power of the ballot box. In August 2021, Zambians shocked the continent by voting out incumbent President Edgar Lungu, who had sought a controversial third term. Despite the use of state media, security forces, and legal instruments to stifle opposition, the people delivered a peaceful electoral transition to opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema. What worked? A mobilized youth vote, supported by digital activism and civil society, strong oversight by local election monitors, and an independent electoral commission, a judiciary that, despite pressure, ruled consistently on constitutional clarity. Zambia reminds Africa that democratic change through the ballot is still possible, even under duress, if institutions are protected and citizens are vigilant. Malawi, judicial independence as a democratic firewall. In 2020, Malawi's constitutional court made history by annulling a fraudulent presidential election, citing widespread irregularities. A fresh vote led to the peaceful election of Lazarus Chakwera, marking one of the continent's most remarkable judicial-led democratic comebacks. What worked? A fearless and independent judiciary that prioritized the rule of law, active civil society watchdogs, and religious groups that built public pressure, international support tied to rule-based governance, not personalities. Malawi proves that even deeply flawed systems can correct course, given courageous judges and public consensus on democratic norms. Ghana, a culture of electoral accountability. Despite imperfections, Ghana remains one of Africa's most respected electoral democracies. Since 1992, it has seen multiple peaceful transfers of power, robust media, a strong opposition, and vibrant public debate. What works? An independent electoral commission with professional credibility. Presidential term limits that are respected by political elites. Regular policy-based debates rather than personality cults or dynastic politics. Ghana exemplifies how democratic norms can become embedded in national culture, not just institutional architecture. Final reflection. What must be done? A message to Africa's leaders. As the continent stands at the crossroads of democratic survival or regression, African leaders must choose their legacy. The cost of authoritarianism is clear: economic decay, international isolation, youth flight, and social unrest. The benefits of democracy, though gradual, are enduring: peace, legitimacy, innovation, and sustainable development. To African leaders, this is our call. Respect term limits. They are not constraints, but commitments to generational equity. Invest in institutions, not personalities. Strong nations are built by processes, not strongmen. Listen to your youth. Their dreams are not threats. They are the blueprint for your nation's future. Engage with civil society. They are not enemies, but partners in nation building. Lead by example. Your tenure is temporary, but your legacy will outlive your power. Summary of key messages. Togo's constitutional reforms are a model of authoritarian entrenchment through legal engineering, threatening democratic norms across Africa. The silence of regional and international bodies has emboldened similar moves in other states. Societal discontent, particularly among youth, is growing and may erupt unpredictably if reforms are not enacted. Despite setbacks, African countries like Zambia, Malawi, and Ghana offer hope, demonstrating that democratic resilience is possible. A coordinated approach involving civil society, diaspora, judiciary, regional bodies, and international partners is essential to reverse democratic backsliding. African leaders must choose courage over control, legacy over longevity, and democracy over dynasty. Togo is not just a story of political betrayal, it is a warning, but it can also be a lesson. May it awaken the conscience of a continent. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, where silence ends and the truth begins. If you believe Africa deserves better, then share this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button for more powerful insights. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss our next deep dive. Together, we hold the line for Africa's future. Until next time, stay bold, stay informed, and stay vigilant.